One of the genuine benefits, I think, of the of formal Zen training is the opportunity to develop a relationship with a teacher. In my own training this evening, I was just reflecting. We practice what's called Rinzai Zen. And so generally speaking, in our school, the interactions between a teacher and student can be fairly charged, as they're based around our investigation of the traditional koans. These are tools for investigating the nature of this reality, what it is to be a human being in this cosmos. But many times in sort of less busy circumstances, when it wasn't an intensive retreat or anything like that, it was just the day-to-day training, we still had interview with the teacher every day, usually 2 or 3 times a day. And during these interviews, there was sometimes an opportunity to ask questions or find out a little bit more, a chance to talk to the teacher. And one of the things that when I first started practicing and training, I was in my early 20s, and I was very concerned with enlightenment and having an awakening experience. I really wanted to wake up and become a Buddha, really become an enlightened person. And I would often go in to see the teacher, and I would say, what do I have to do to get this stuff? What do I have to do to grasp this Dharma, this teaching? And so many times, my teacher would say to me, only grow up. Only grow up. And I grew up in a family where I was the youngest child, the only boy, and I had 2 older sisters. And so something that my sisters often said to me was, just grow up. Why don't you grow up? Don't be such a baby. Grow up. But when my teacher said to me, only grow up, it didn't have that same condescension to it. It didn't have that same ridicule to it as when my sisters used to say it to me. In this teaching of the Dharma, in the Zen school, we understand awakening not as something outside of us, not as something external, some special state, some product that we strive after, try to grasp and own. It's not some special place that we have to get to. It is the realization of our own nature. When the historical Buddha Shakyamuni was sitting underneath the Bodhi tree and had his profound realization, he exclaimed, "Wonder of wonders, fundamentally we are all already awake, but we don't realize it." This was always very challenging for me to grasp or to accept in practice, because I'd always grown up in a culture and in a tradition that taught that we were fundamentally broken, that we were fundamentally marked somehow, and that mark, that impurity, could never come clean. And in this teaching of the Dharma, the Buddha Dharma, it was quite the opposite. That our fundamental nature was not only wise, but wisdom itself. That as a human being, we have nothing to be ashamed of, nothing to be afraid of. For it is in this being a human being, fully being a human being, that we find what it is to be awake. We find what it is to become a Buddha. Because in this teaching, a Buddha is nothing other than a human being who is fully awake. Even the word Buddha means just the one who is awake. We spend so much of our time chasing after things that we think we need, running away from things that we think we are diminished by or that will destroy us. We spend so much of our time thinking and judging and criticizing ourselves and others that the truth, this fundamental truth that just as we are whole, we are complete, we are home, escapes us. We are deluded into thinking that we are separate from this world that we live in, that we are separate from our environment, that we are separate from our actions, that we are separate from each other. And as we engage in this practice of simply being with what's happening in this very moment, as we engage in this practice of simply opening ourselves, becoming vulnerable to the complete activity that is unfolding as this moment, we begin to grasp our nature. Little bit by little bit, we realize this little narrow box that we've stuffed ourselves into, that we call I, is not the whole story, is not our complete self. Little bit by little bit, the stories that we keep repeating about what kind of a person we are, about what kind of things we like, what kind of things we do and don't do. All these stories start to fade into the background, and little bit by little bit, we begin to grasp the immeasurable immensity, the vastness of our own nature, our own capacity, our own wisdom that is already present when we simply take the time to open ourselves to accept it. When we simply take the time to be honest about what it is that we are experiencing. For me, when I talk about growing up, there are a couple of components that are very important. And the first is the capacity to see, to actually grasp the situation as it is. In Buddhism, this is the first step, I guess you could say, of the Eightfold Noble Path, the fundamental teaching of Buddhism, right view. Being able to just settle in and see things as they are. As we sit, all kinds of things come up. All kinds of thoughts arise in our heads. All kinds of emotions arise in our hearts. All kinds of physical sensations arise in our body. And our practice is to learn to be stable, to be still, not to resist, but to allow these things to arise, to exist, and to pass. Consistency in practice is important because we are coming to know ourselves. We begin to see patterns. We begin to see habits. We begin to see things that create suffering for ourselves and for others that we willingly, consciously or unconsciously participate in. We begin to see. That fundamental awareness that is cultivated and developed through zazen, seated meditation, is our foundation. The second part of growing up that I think is absolutely crucial is being honest about what it is that we are seeing. Part of the value of practicing in a form like Zen and practicing with a community is that the form kind of reveals us to ourselves and to the community that we practice with. It creates this wonderful opportunity for us to become more and more honest with what we see, with what we experience about our habits and our preferences, and the consequences of pursuing our habits and preferences. And the final part, this unending activity of growing up, is the acceptance of responsibility. Recognizing that we can't deceive ourselves. Engaging in a practice of continuously opening our eyes and becoming more aware. We can't get away from ourselves. We can't deceive ourselves. And when we accept this, when we surrender to this fundamental awareness that we can't escape ourselves, we begin to realize that our experience, the experience of everybody in contact with us, is largely dependent upon how much we accept responsibility for this activity that we call our own life. When we do this, when we recognize our part, when we recognize that this little thing that we call our life is a tiny speck in a vast fabric, but when we realize that the choices that we make, through the choices that we make as this tiny speck, we impact the whole thing. It's a big responsibility. When we move, the universe moves. I think one of the reasons why people are so resistant to responsibility, so resistant to growing up, is that that responsibility is terrifying. It's really big. We recognize that we are one with all things in this vast cosmos. We recognize that there is nowhere else to go. We recognize that there is no other thing for us to be doing than this, right here, what we're doing in this moment. In each and every moment of our lives, there's nowhere else for us to be, for us to go. There's nothing else for us to do. and we feel the responsibility of living our lives fully. We feel the responsibility to wake up. So if we come to investigate Buddhism, if we come to study Zen, we want to learn to meditate, I think this piece of advice, what is it that we have to do? Only grow up is a good place to start.
Thanks for listening to the Living Zen podcast. If you follow Living Zen through iTunes, I would very much appreciate it if you would take a moment to let me know what you think about it by rating or reviewing the podcast, so that new listeners can also hear what you have to say. Thank you for your time and for your support.